Hello, everyone, and welcome to this program of the Brandywine Museum of Art. I see folks are steadily logging in. We've got wonderful interest in this program, and I've been eagerly looking forward to this conversation ahead to learn from a real legend in the field of Wyeth studies and art history in general. Just some technical notes to begin. We are using Zoom's webinar feature, which includes a handy Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that I hope you'll use over the course of our conversation. If you think of any burning questions, we'll get to as many of those questions there at the end as possible. Roughly 45 minutes of conversation between me and Professor Wanda M, and then 15 minutes of open dialogue at the end, where I'll pose the questions we can from the Q&A field. There's also a chat button at the bottom of your screen where you're welcome to just share perspective on what you're hearing or where you're tuning in from. Have at it. There is a caption function. Show captions is an option at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to use it. And we should note that we are recording this webinar because it serves a dual purpose. This is both a general interest public program of the Brandywine and its Wyeth Study Center, and it's also serving an archival value for the Wyeth Study Center. So this will live on. The questions we ask Professor Korn will be archived. So we invite you to join in that ongoing historical research process by posing such questions as may capture your mind. I'll also let you know that the recording will be sent around in a week or two to people who have registered for this event, as well as to those who get Brandywine's e-blasts, which will also let you know about great upcoming programs like some talks from Victoria Wyeth, Andrew and Betsy Wyeth's granddaughter, on January 30th and 31st. On February 7th, another virtual program by yours truly, speaking about the upcoming exhibition, Andrew Wyeth Home Places, which will run from February 4th through July 13th. And then there will be the next of these new Wyeth Conversations on March 7th with the legendary conservator with a particular interest in matters Wyeth, Joyce Hill Stoner. So this program, and I should just clarify who I am and the perspective from which I speak. I'm William L. Coleman. I'm Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center at the Brandywine Museum of Art, with additional responsibilities for staff and collections at the Farnsworth Art Museum in Maine. We are entering into this exciting new era of collaboration between the Wyeth Foundation for American Art and the Brandywine. And this series of conversations is going to be one of these many efforts as we try to invite new people into Wyeth world, do new interesting projects, scholarly research, and indeed public programs like this one to offer insight into Wyeth world. So more of this to come. Stay tuned. Keep an eye out for more good things of this kind, and we'll be eager to hear your perspectives and thoughts when we get to the dialogue later. Without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, which is a kind of a strange thing to do if you think about it, because we're going to get a lot of insight into her background and journey over the course of this conversation. But because not all of you may be as familiar with Professor Korn as we in the field of American art history are, I wanted to share at least a few notes so you understand how fortunate we are to hear from Professor Korn today. She is let me get the title right, Robert and Ruth Halperin Professor Emerita of Art History at Stanford University, where she served for nearly 30 years, including stints as the director of its Humanities Center and its art museum. She has been a builder of institutions, a founder and driver of essential parts of this wider field, like the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, that we'll talk about a bit later, and the Association of Historians of American Art, among many other commitments and collaborations. Her scholarship ranges far and wide, pioneering books and articles that continue to be essential in the scholarly discipline of art history of the United States. But in particular, you see where this is going. She has had a long, fascinating, and frankly important journey with this remarkable creative partnership of Andrew and Betsy Wyeth. So we're going to hear about that today. Wyeth will be a through line in our conversation. I'll jump into showing some images because there's a good way to show just how deep this goes. I thought it would be appropriate to share Her first major book on Andrew Wyeth, and then her most recent scholarly work on Andrew Wyeth. This exhibition catalog book, The Art of Andrew Wyeth. We'll hear more about that exhibition project shortly. And then an essay, Lifting the Curse, in the 2014 volume, Rethinking Andrew Wyeth. So a long journey there, so many interesting stories in between, and this contribution continues to the field today. So in short, you see, we are very fortunate to be hearing from Wanda M today. Welcome, Wanda. And it looks like you are muted. We hope to hear your voice before long, but at least you can see the face with those distinctive glasses. Her style is famous in the field as well. But
okay, I'm here now.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much for doing this, Wanda. We have, let's see how many folks there. I can't see that. There it is. 241 people tuned in. And who knows how many more people will watch the recording later. We really appreciate the chance to hear about your journey with this creative story in art history, as well as a wider career. So we should begin at the beginning. How did you come to a passion for art in general and to a life with art history in particular?
Well, thank you. That's a big, broad question. And let me just quickly say salut if this is cocktail hour for you, or bon appetit if you're working on your meal. I'm pleased that so many have tuned in. This is something of a walk down memory lane, and I'll try to also sort of bring that all up to date. But frankly, it's hard for me to say this, but I am talking about an exhibition I did exactly 50 years ago, but still very momentous in my youth. It's almost, I guess, for an art historian who hadn't yet published much or hadn't even finished her PhD. It's kind of juvenilia, but it's juvenilia that I've stayed in touch with and has indeed been a thread of my life as well.
And that the field has stayed in touch with, more importantly. It may be your juvenilia, but it is still essential scholarship that broke ground for people like me to follow after. So there will be a lot of flattery in our proceedings here today, whether you like it or not, because it is justly deserved. So where did it all begin for you, Wanda?
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly say that I speak to you from Cape Cod. On family property, in fact, summer family property that is now for seasonal property for me and my siblings. I grew up in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, summered on Cape Cod, and I went to Bates College. And it was in Bates College that I ran into art in a set of courses called the Culture, we called them, the history of Western culture, very popular in the can we say it, 50s, late 50s, early 60s. And I decided this, what intrigued me was that visual things could actually tell history. I was a history major, and I just had never been taught to interpret anything other than verbal things. Logo centric, I guess, was our upbringing at that particular point. And I left Bates because it didn't have any art history. I just had it as little bits and pieces, and I ended up at NYU. And I did 3 degrees at New York University. I went abroad for a couple of years. That's where I got my first training in art history. And then I went back to NYU undergraduate at Washington Square College. And from there, I went on to the Institute of Fine Arts, where eventually I got my PhD. But I started really, this was and there it is. Thank you very much. That's 1 East 78th Street, famous in those of us that know our art history graduate schools, because right across the street is the Metropolitan Museum. But I will say, just as a bit of sort of a feminist insight, so I enter my graduate training here in '63, and I had no idea that I would ever go for a PhD. I was headed towards some kind of education, maybe museum education, since I was so interested in doing something with visual, the visual that I was going to be studying. I went to the Institute as a medievalist. And I left as a modernist because that was a field. You had to choose your field. And in those days, the only thing that came close to incorporating American artists was something called modern. And that started with the French Revolution, and it ended with the New York School that was presently underway. And within that, I was allowed, and I have to say I was allowed, I had to sort of petition to do this, to make a subfield, the history of American art. But that's where we were in the study of art history then. There was no such thing as we didn't put a kind of box around something called American art. We didn't use the word Americanist, which is what we began to do. My generation began to do, a few of us began to do, and then we've lent it to the rest of you that have come along in our wake. But that's where it all started. And I studied there with Robert Goldwater was my main advisor, and H.W. Jansen was was another advisor.
And that name Jansen might ring some bells for some of our attendees, famous for those art history textbooks that were referred to just as Jansen. I started out with Jansen as well. So you've been in contact with legends and become one yourself. It's helpful to be reminded that this discipline that folks like me could go on and specialize in was not inevitable, that there had to be this early scuffle and scrape to get the academy to take the art of this young country seriously. And it continues to grow and expand to incorporate more stories. So fascinating to hear about those beginnings. So where does California enter into this? How on earth did this Northeastern girl end up in California?
Well, that's a key question, and frankly, it's a very it's one of the most important things that I think happened to me biographically. My husband decided he wanted. I always say to him that he thought he had been trained as a lawyer, but was just getting started and had decided to teach instead, partially because teachers didn't have to then stand for the draft of the Vietnam War. And then I think he thought I was having more fun with my academic career than he was envisioning he was going to have with his law career. So he decided he would go on to become a historian. And he went to Berkeley. And so in the fall of '69, I'm ABD. That means all but dissertation for those of you that aren't in the academy. And that means you've done your coursework, you've done your exams, you've probably got a dissertation mapped out, as I did. And we drove across country to start a new life in California and didn't really return for 40 years.
Fascinating times to be making that move. And I was about to laugh about how it's nice to be a teacher because you get summer vacation, and you reminded me about teachers having a very different implication when there's a military draft. So fascinating times. I hope we'll get to other things in the ether in San Francisco in the late 1960s, as it were, later. But it sounds like you very quickly found your footing on the other side of the country and got into the swing seemingly effortlessly with exhibitions and teaching. Can you help us understand how that took shape?
Well, I think one thing that I would want all of you to kind of remember is that I doubt that San Francisco or even Los Angeles was much on your museum art map in the late 60s. It certainly wasn't on mine. In fact, I thought so little of the museums I might be meeting when I went to San Francisco that I had arranged to come back and take an internship at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts my first summer out there. I did not do that. I ended up, in fact, and this is part of the story, staying because when they saw that I was looking for an internship and I had actually Ford Foundation funding to pay me to do it someplace, I ended up doing it in San Francisco. But this is just to say that these were California museums were regional museums at the time. And in the case of San Francisco, there were two museums run by both with long histories, but two different families had started them. I won't go into all of it, but there was the DeYoung Museum of the newspaper family and the California Palace of the Legion of Honor, which was the Spreckels family of the sugar fame. And I don't know really all that much about their early history, but it come late 60s, early 70s, it was becoming clear to leadership in San Francisco, cultural leadership, that the two museums, separate from one another with two boards, overlapping patrons sometimes, just had to merge and become a single institution to, if you will, kind of survive in the very big museum world that they wanted to be a part of, that they weren't going to be able to do it as individual institutions. And as it turned out, I arrived in San Francisco just as this merger was being discussed and implemented. I had no idea. In fact, I didn't even know what the two institutions, but it was my good fortune that the Ian White, the founding director of the joint Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, was taking over the directorship. He was young. He had his first job was to bring in a curator. The curator was Lanier Graham from New York, and it just so happened that I knew Lanier Graham. And so when Lanier heard by the grapevine that I was out there, he was looking for every bit of art historical skill he could get his hands on, because it was rough going. There was very small staff. And we're looking at the two pictures here. We're looking at the DeYoung today. The DeYoung you may very well have known and then visited. And that's this beautiful structure on the right. And then the DeYoung I'm talking about, which is the DeYoung of the early 20th century. And that's the one where I did 4 or 5 exhibitions during the 70s and began my work there. I should say, Will, just to kind of, because this is interesting for people who are studying art history today, in those days, it was never clear exactly why you were getting graduate degrees, except to become scholars. But what you were going to do to make a living, teaching was always an option, but so was museum work. And there was a great deal of concern that maybe the university world was heating up and growing art departments very quickly in the 70s. And there was a great deal of concern that there wasn't the same kind of training for museum curators. And there was kind of tension around whether a museum curator really needed a PhD and so on. But at the Institute, they started a program in museum training. And because I thought I might be a museum educator, not even really knowing exactly what that was, because it wasn't much of a field at that point. It is today. I took those courses. You could do those courses as part of your training. And then you got something called a certificate in museum training. I don't know if anything actually physically ever arrived like that. So I was a kind of hybrid person when I arrived in San Francisco. I had this great museum training. I had this lust after studying objects and working with them. I had done an internship at the Museum of Modern Art in New York for a full summer and helped put together an exhibition of 20th century posters in the architecture and design department. And I really was kind of on the fence as to what I would do. And as it turned out, when I was invited to be a guest curator and to do that internship turned out to be an exhibition of my choice. And I did an exhibition on what we today called, and I named, American tonalism. Now we're talking about January of 72 when that exhibition opened. And that show was actually not at the DeYoung, it was at the Legion of Honor as a way to kind of publicize that these two museums, because the Legion of Honor was a museum of French art, traditionally. And to put the two museums together and to say, well, we're now going to show each other's fields. They made a statement by putting my exhibition at the California Palace, the Legion of Honor. So that's what got me going. And from there, it flowed, not by my own design, but Ian White was, in the meantime, unbeknownst to me, thinking about doing an Andrew Wyeth show and was kind of working, if you will, the back of stage to make that happen. He had himself, he knew of Andy's work. Everybody, I think, in the museum world did. He was somebody who had come to museum attention very, very early and was being shown regularly. And Ian tells me that he basically knew watercolors from one of his advisors at Harvard, had some of Andy's work on his walls. But it also was the fact that one of the trustees at the DeYoung was a major watercolor collector, George Fitch. And it was his idea, Ian tells me, reminds me, that we should bring Wyeth to the West Coast. And if you remember back then, which most of you would have no reason to do, but in fact, Wyeth had been very seriously shown in New York. He had been seriously shown in Boston, Pennsylvania, but he had not been shown far west at all. He had the biggest exhibition he had been organized by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And it had gone on to Baltimore and to the Whitney Museum, which is when I believe I first saw my first Wyeths in 1967. And then it went to Chicago. So Ian's mission was to bring Wyeth west of Chicago and to, in fact, use this as, if you will, a kind of foundational brick to the founding of this new entity called the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. So that's a lot of background, but there you are.
That's fascinating. And this is all the better if I don't have to do much of the talking, because you are naturally flowing. We're sort of understanding how you came to this very young museum community in the Bay Area. They needed good people. There was greater opportunity to a certain extent out there. And this idea was waiting to be taken up by the right person. It sounds like you were primed to a certain level of respect and interest in Andrew Wyeth, but what kind of preconceptions did you bring when this remarkable figure, Ian Wyeth, sits you down and says, I'd like you to bring us the first Andrew Wyeth exhibition in the Far West?
Well, if you want honesty, my first answer was no. I'm sorry, I've just put this exhibition together with its little book on American tonalism. I have to finish my dissertation. Mm-hmm. And I had an unfinished sort of roughly, what should I say, sort of worked out, but a totally unfinished dissertation. And I was getting a little panicky. I was also teaching at Mills College off and on, and at UC Berkeley. So I was a pretty busy person. And I just knew that taking on an Andrew Wyeth show was a major commitment. And also I hadn't studied him. Who had studied? Nobody studied contemporary artists in those days. In fact, the wisdom in the university was that you didn't write dissertations about living artists. You couldn't, in fact, I think the kind of rule of thumb was you shouldn't write about anyone who hadn't been dead for 20 years. And my earlier dissertation, which was about American modernism, early 20th century modernism, was all about, if not dead artists, very aged artists. I had already interviewed Charles Sheeler as one of my artists. And in fact, a little bit later on, I would interview George O'Keeffe. But so I said no. And Ian became a good friend and was also a very good boss and also very patient. And he said, well, do me a favor. Let me go back and bring you with me and introduce you to the Wyeths. I saw them this past summer. He has kind of, he has Maine roots, he and his wife. And so they had dropped in on the Wyeths on appointment to basically talk them into this idea of having a West Coast exhibition. But of course, the Wyeths were hesitant. They didn't know Ian very well, just meeting him for like the second time for Andy's sake. So anyway, I agreed I would go back with Ian, and I will tell a quick story or two. So I go back and I go to Chad's Ford. It must have been I think it must have been the spring of '72. I can't believe how fast we put this show together, but we did it in just a year, possibly 13 months, because it was a big exhibition. And it was a big book. So in the meantime, I'm thinking, well, maybe if I didn't write the whole book myself, maybe if I made it a series of essays, but I was determined that if I was going to do this show, first I had to enjoy the artist or get to know him and feel that we had some rapport. But secondly, I was determined that I was going to do a book that was unlike what he had been getting in previous shows, which were basically what a catalog was in those days. It was a list of the works on exhibition, sometimes with short paragraphs about each work, sometimes with a few pages of introduction, but not what we consider a catalog today. And as I look back on what we produced, we really were kind of in the forefront of what became rather standard in the museum business. Anyway, we came back to Chad's Ford, and I met the Wyeths, and that we were shown around the mill. This is where we had our appointments, and talked, and I was really startled by what mensch they were, that they were really such interesting people to talk to. I think I kind of expected Andy to be more of a bumpkin rather than a kind of a gentleman villager. And I didn't know quite wasn't prepared for anything. For Betsy, I just didn't know much about her. She was really just getting going. She'd gotten the Brandywine, helped to get the Brandywine established just then. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it didn't open around 71, and we're talking 72. And she just published this magnificent, which was very helpful to me, set of letters by N.C. Wyeth. So she was doing a lot of groundwork behind the scenes, and that's what I sort of got to know about her, that she was an amazingly active person in putting together the whole Brandywine story, not just the Wyeth story, but the Brandywine story, and fitting Andy into it, and was basically a self-trained archivist historian. So I will tell one little story, though. She wasn't sure upon our first meeting that what kind of a job I would do. And I can see from her perspective, I was not her previous contacts. People who had done the exhibitions before were the likes of E.P. Richardson, a major museum director, and himself a curator and trained as an artist, I believe, at one point. And Agnes Mongan had done a show at the Fog. And here I was, 30 years old, coming in without any previous, anything to look at, to show her that I would do. And it was clear she was looking me over for the job I might perform. So she and it's very typical of me in those days, and still today, I think, is to sort of be very careful and observe before I plunge. And I probably was very observant, if not awestruck, and a little terrified on that first meeting. So the upshot of it all was that she wanted to meet me again. And I went back and we had a girl-to-girl talk. And I can never forget that, and everything went fine. And I rather reluctantly, but now I've totally bought into this idea, because I'm finding them such interesting people. And I'm also finding that Andy had not been written about in any way that really, it seemed to me, was very historical. It was always coming out of more the field of criticism than the field of history. So, and then I tell myself that I won't really take too much time out of my dissertation. I'll just whip this out and I'll just write one essay. Well, it turned out to be a very, very long and involved essay. I really tried to get my arms around his work and to sort of put him into the 20th century in a historical way. And so I ended up spending the next year completely immersed in this project and seeing them often, because you needed Betsy's records to make your checklist and to have contacts with collectors. She was absolutely essential on that ground.
This is fascinating. It's so valuable to hear about how even at that early date, Betsy is such a central part of the story, such a fascinating power behind the throne, as it were, and kind of gatekeeper in your experience, that you had to convince her you were going to be responsible and thoughtful about this stuff. She wasn't going to entrust just anyone with these contacts and the insights that you could only get from the family. It's been a fascinating part of stepping into this Chad's Ford world and this new role at the Brandywine, to seem like everybody, it seems, had these direct personal contacts with the Wyeths, like you, everybody except me. So I really value those stories of what that dynamo, that powerful force Betsy James Wyeth was like when you first met her. Just as it's fascinating to hear how your preconceptions about Andy, as those who knew him personally call him, were confounded, that he was not the bumpkin you expected, but a really fascinating person.
Yeah. Can I just tell two quick little stories?
Yeah.
Just because this is for local color.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I've told, I know I've told one, but not the second one personally. But when I went to meet them in, I think it was maybe my first visit to Cushing, which is where they were spending the summers then in Maine. It was basically, I was fact checking. and trying to get some more information from Andy. And the way you did that was you had cocktails with the Wyeths. And everybody knows this. The magic moment in the Wyeth world day was sort of, I don't know, 5:30, 6 o'clock, something like that, which was when they would see guests and when Andy would have had his day, presumably in the studio or wandering and doing watercolors or whatever. If you went during the day, it was to work with Betsy, and I did some of that. Anyway, we had this wonderful cocktail hour together, and I was with my husband, and I think my brother was with me that time as well. And we're chatting, and as usual, Andy is usually the focal point because he tells stories and he's funny and he's totally relaxed. Betsy is always hard at work, it seems to me, during those days, much of the time. In her mind, so to speak, that she's always working so hard behind the scenes. And so her job with me was always to make sure I was getting things straight and nudging me on. And I always wanted to please her. I have to say, I had a very definite sense that if I wanted to please anybody, I wanted to please Betsy, more so than Andy even. I think Andy, I felt, would go with the flow, but Betsy I knew had high standards, and I wanted to meet them. In any case, that night, late day, it actually, sun hadn't gone down yet, Andy suddenly jumps up. He's sitting across the room from me, and he comes over, and I'm wearing a green blouse with polka dots. I have a thing for polka dots. And he said, the light on your face and on that shirt. He said, it's just perfect. I want to paint you. Well, I had an exhibition. I had terrific pressure getting this book done. And this must have been like July or August. And I can't work out the chronology. But anyway, maybe it was even September. But I know I had book deadlines, absolutely book deadlines. And I thought, I know how long it takes you to do a painting. It didn't occur to me he might just have whipped up a watercolor, but I had a plane ticket home the next day. And I had to finish. I was there to get, footnote information kind of thing. I had to leave as far as I was concerned. And I went home and I saw Betsy, and Betsy dragged me sort of aside and said, you have to do this. You have to do this. And I thought to myself, well, I'd love to do this. I'd love to do this. But I just don't, I've got commitments. I can't imagine how I could do this, because I kept thinking he'll want 2 months of me. And then what'll happen? I won't be able to finish this exhibition. Anyway, I probably was a little rigid and silly. I went home and I took a long swim where we were staying and thought about it and thought how insightful it would be if he really did do a tempera. He didn't say tempera. He might have just done a drawing. I don't know. But I thought how much I might learn about his process and how fascinating that would be. Anyway, Betsy sent me off with these words, and this I want for the archive. She was angry at me. And she said, Wanda, the good ones find a way to get the cows milked. Great statement. In other words, I should figure out how to get that book written and finished and meet my deadlines, get the cow milked, and stay and be a sitter. Well, I just couldn't do it. So I called her. She said, you go away and think about it. I didn't sleep a wink that night. And I did think about it, and I couldn't work it out in my head. Couldn't work it out. So I leave you with that for the archives.
Wow, that is a great story.
The unmade work.
This is a side of sitting for Andrew Wyeth that we have not heard before. I've heard a lot of romantic tales of how he looked into your soul, and it was such a privilege to get this undivided attention. I have not heard the pressure, the time commitment, the intensity of that encounter. So that's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, and the other quick story, and this I'll be very fast. I wanted very much to have the opportunity to show for the first time nude paintings of nudes by Andrew Wyeth. Those had not been seen anywhere in the country. And if you remember, Christina had died in the late 60s, and he had begun to paint Siri. Erickson in Maine. And I was shown some of those paintings, and they were so interesting. And the world did not know at that point anything about this group. And I begged for those paintings to show them in San Francisco, thinking that would be the, if you will, the kind of highlight of my show, as opposed to other shows that he had in the East. Well, they said no. I should say Betsy said no. I think she was holding out for the very best possible glamorous moment to show them. And San Francisco was so remote. When I sent them a copy of the book, which it was one of those wonderful occasions where you actually could have the book a few weeks before the show opened, I sent a copy of the book. They were so pleased that they called me immediately and said, you can have the series paintings that have been completed to date. They are not in the catalog because the book was done. I see. But we did have the chance to do something very special in San Francisco. We had to completely reorganize the installation. It was already pretty tight. Order up new paneling and all kinds of things. But anyway, so I did get a great thank you at the end of the day.
That's lovely. I want to be sure to show people some install shots from the show, even as I'm conscious of our time. I want to get to other parts of your story, some glimpses of this exhibition about which we've now heard the process. You'll see some familiar pictures there, some of the icons of Wyeth world, and incredible to think that you got together about the complex logistics of loans and insurance and crating and all that in something like 14 months or less. We in the museum field know how long these things take. So what a feat that was. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say about what we see.
Well, I just would say two things. One is, you notice it's not a white cube. And this is 1973. Most installations, I believe, to date had been done against white walls. We thought we had a very youthful team that did this exhibition, designed it and put it together. And we thought we were being very avant-garde in actually putting Wyeth's works against this kind of gray. I'm sorry, these pictures are so pink, but these are slides made into pictures, and they're 50 years old. So it's a wonder we have them at all. It was the designer's idea to make colored panels. And then if you look at the one on the left, you'll see Far From Needham way at the back on the right. And if you look next to that, there's two photographs right there. Those are two photographs that my brother actually photographed for me when we were in Maine of the rock that's in Needham. And I think the other thing that we thought we were quite dashing in doing is that we actually did what you might call, educational materials within the exhibition. And you didn't do that yet in 73. You might have a little room that would be biographical or give you some sense of the technique. But we were just on the verge of seeing that wall labels and wall documentary photographs like this could actually teach audiences something and give them something richer, something to go away with that beyond just the works of art.
Fascinating. That just seems inevitable to us today. I was not aware of that part of your contribution, but I'm pleased to see that story drawn out here. There's a detail. Shoot.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. That's even better. Wish I remembered this.
So that's all. And you see that little white stick there is probably about the process and the story he told me about how he went making that painting. And I'm introducing the audience to that within the exhibition.
Wonderful. Now let's see young Wanda Corn in these period. I love these pictures. And I think of this as a segue toward a question that I think will be interesting to our audience, which is, we all have certain pictures in our mind when we think of San Francisco circa 1969. And so we get maybe a little sense of that, the van, the stickers, the blue jeans. How did the famous counterculture moment of that period shape how you thought about art history, about the world, about the path you were taking within it as a young museum professional, a young art historian?
Yeah, for me, it's the long hair, because I've had short hair every bit of my life except for the 70s. Yes, again, these are slides made into pictures. That's my husband with the longest hair he ever had in his life. He can barely stand this picture. And that's me over looking at I've come upon a van that's actually sporting Andrew Wyeth car stickers. And I was so pleased. And you notice that I'm carrying a bunch of catalogs.
There you go.
I will say, coming to Berkeley in '69, to a campus that was aflame in many ways, and filled with very contentious politics, and also a university that was questioning so much of the way of handling every field in the humanities. My husband's training in history was so unlike the formal training I had had on the East Coast. I felt like I was getting I guess I felt like I was being told I could do history differently than I had been taught. And I had been taught as a formalist, very much so, at the Institute of Fine Arts. You looked at the painting, you did not think about context, you didn't think about the history of the artist and what she had experienced. And this is too long a topic for our evening excursion here, but I really totally rethought myself as an art historian in that environment. I hadn't quite gotten there with Wyeth, but maybe I had, because I took the show on. And if I'd been in New York, probably there would have been so much sort of what we call the Wyeth curse surrounding him that I might not have had the courage to do it. I don't know. But I found the very liberal and sort of explosive nature of being in the Bay Area at this time that was very healthy for me. And it made me rethink and feel freer as an art historian than I had ever experienced on the East Coast.
I see. I would love to hear a little bit about the aftermath of all this, because you contributed to the exodus of people like me for the Bay Area to study American art in subsequent decades, and with limited time and so much to talk about. Could you tell us a little bit about your contributions to building that remarkable collection at the De Young, and the growth of American art on that in the Bay Area in general?
Well, I can say with great sort of certainty that there was only one person who taught any course with the word American art in it in the Bay Area when I arrived. And that was Alfred Frankenstein, who was the critic for the Chronicle. And he had a passion for American art, and he kind of he'd taken on a couple of projects of his own, Harnett and Pido being a major one, and written books on it. He was not a trained art historian. He was a trained humanist, and then had self-taught himself to be a critic. First a music critic, and then he went to the visual. He, like me, had kind of a moment of understanding that the visual was for him more interesting than where he had been previously. He had, I think, a degree from the University of Chicago. Anyway, he invented courses, 2 courses. They were basic, what we would call survey courses. First half of American art and the second half of American art. And I'm not sure exactly when he started it. I would say it was probably in the early 60s. And he offered them, as we would say today, adjunct courses, because he was a full-time critic at the Chronicle while he did this. And he taught them at Berkeley and at Mills College. Otherwise, there was no American art in the Bay Area. There was no such thing as graduate work there. I think that's why, again, I was so lucky, because I didn't have any competition when I arrived. I was one of the few people that even knew what American art was, that was running around calling themselves an art historian, a young art historian at that point for me. And Ian White and Lanier Graham had made it their mission to focus on American art, to make that one of the big. They wanted to make that one of the big parts of their permanent collection. They had a rump collection, but they had a commitment. They thought this could be a field they could build up and make it a keystone collection as part of these 2 museums that had come together. They already had a pretty good French collection, but not that much of an American collection. So it was part of their mission to do so. So I don't know if you want to go from there to Rockefeller, but
please, yeah, this is the story that deserves to be told. Yeah.
Yeah. So in 1976, I'm now teaching full time at Mills College, but again, Ian White made these arrangements. He convinced John D. Rockefeller III, who was rather a secret collector of American art at that time. That is, it wasn't well known except amongst dealers and so on, that he was creating this really magnificent collection with the help of E.P. Richardson, who was his main advisor. Ian convinced Mr. Rockefeller and his wife Blanchette to show his collection for the first time, sort of come out, if you will, as a major collector of American art in the year of the bicentennial, 1976. And there I was again, the sort of, now I'm the at-home local guest curator of American art. And so Ian asked me if I would do the exhibition and if I would also do something, and this was very pioneering and ambitious, would I teach American art? Let's see, I got to think about this, but Al Frankenstein, maybe he had to retire. There was a sort of, you had to retire at a certain age. And when he retired, I took over not his job, just his job as an Americanist, but I became the post-Renaissance art person at Mills. And at Berkeley, I became the person who, as an adjunct, taught American art courses. So we taught American art. I taught American art based on paintings in the Rockefeller collection in 76 at Berkeley and at Mills. I did 2 different courses, and we got a grant and we bussed our students in and sat them on the floor on Saturdays at 9 o'clock in the morning in front of the Rockefeller paintings and taught the history of American art. And I did evening programs, and it was just, we did as much as we could do. And honestly, the not so hidden agenda was make Mr. Rockefeller see that San Francisco is going to make very good use of his collection when he gets, if he ever would do so much as to think of giving it to, because he was going to give it, that's the Rockefeller way. They give their collections away eventually. And it was very clear that if he were to give it to San Francisco, we would make very good use of it. And it worked, so to speak. They were lovely people. I worked with both Rockefellers. It was a great gig. What can I say? It was an opportunity. I didn't write the catalog. E.P. Richardson did that, their advisor, but I did all the surround, if you will, and I did the installation. And 2 or 3 years later, the magic burst open, and he gave his entire collection to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And that meant then that now we had a collection to work with. And honestly, that's where you come in, Will, because that opened up the possibility for Berkeley to take American art more seriously and give a position to it. The first position was a half-time position. Margaretta Lovell, God bless her, she took on a position that was not easy. She was half-time curator of the Rockefeller and American collection at the Fine Arts Museums and half-time at Berkeley, where of course there is and was then a graduate program, which she was basically the founding person to move along. They had never produced a student in American art up until then. And then as it turned out, I did the same at Stanford, going there from Mills in 1980. So it's sort of a story of getting American art going in San Francisco.
It's a remarkable story, as I can attest firsthand to all of our attendees. We thought it was worth pausing to note that because she really built this fascinating node of the field, this collaboration between Stanford and Berkeley around the Bay Area, around American art that I was a beneficiary of. So that story continues. It's a remarkable thing she built there. Before we move on from the San Francisco story, there's so much to say about Stanford and so much more. We have to be brief, but I do want to ask, did the Wyeths come to see your exhibition? Did you get any feedback on the project?
Yeah, thanks. The answer is no, they didn't. I wasn't totally surprised. I know that they shied away from big public events and they shied away from getting on airplanes. So I wasn't totally surprised. Ian reminded me the other day when I spoke with him that Andy expressed some concern about earthquakes. I had forgotten that if I knew that. So no, they didn't see the show. I sent them installation shots and we talked on the phone, as I recall. But they did send, as their ambassadors, Jamie and Phyllis Wyeth. And they came to the opening and represented Andy and Betsy. And they were absolutely charming. And they're both very skilled and good at doing that kind of event. And I've come to know and love Jamie and Phyllis. But that was our first meeting. And then the other thing they did is that they sent other people that I was really thrilled to meet and walk through the exhibition. Henriette Wyeth, Andy's sister, the great painter from Texas, came, and we spent a lovely day together. And she was so interesting. She would tell one story after another about the paintings. And then I suppose one of the great days of my life was walking Lincoln Kirsten through the exhibition, who was a strong interpreter and somebody who really understood Wyeth paintings and Wyeth as a painter and knew the Wyeths very well. And I had really missed talking to people like that. And so we had a great day together, and he is one of our great 20th century art thinkers, collectors, and commentators to this day, and quite independent in his thought, we have to say. Not always thinking along the same lines as major other thinkers, but I had a great day.
Absolutely. A fascinating part of the Wyeth story is I've been learning that he did not hesitate to tell Andy when he thought he was on the wrong track. He was a powerful patron, not just collector, but patron, interacting with the artist and shaping thought in a fascinating period there. So wonderful that you got to meet him. I think we're going to have to unfortunately skip over one topic for which I created a slide. So we'll quickly give a glimpse at this whole story. If anybody wants to ask Wanda about Grant Wood, a continuing story in the questions, we could take it up there. But I do want to turn to this story, which is particularly relevant to Brandywine members. And I should warn all, we're going to go a little over time. If you have to log off, no harm done. There will be a recording later, so you can always see what we missed. But I want to get a few more good questions in here before we turn to those you're most welcome to enter in the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. And we'll ask as many of those as we can. But Wanda, please tell us a little bit about your contribution to founding an organization that is most relevant to the Brandywine, the Historic Artists Homes and Studios program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So just to clarify what we're looking at here, we've got the Andrew Wyeth studio from the outside and the inside at top, the NC Wyeth studio, also used by Carolyn there, Georgia O'Keeffe's in Abiquiu, New Mexico, and then my former employer, Olana, Frederick Church's place in the Mid-Hudson Valley. So Georgia O'Keeffe, another interest of Wanda's, Olana's one of mine. So these are sites of creative practice that bring Wanda and I together. They're important to the Brandywine story as it cares for its historic properties. And one of Wanda's many legacies is helping this unifying organization to get started. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'll be quick because I know we're short on time, and I'll try to be shorter than I might be. I do have an origins story, but I'm going to skip that. It all started about 22 years ago. The National Trust is the home of the Historic Artists Homes and Studios. It's a national organization. Think of it as something like the national parks, except instead of a consortium of parks, it's a consortium of preserved and interpreted and open to the public artists' homes and studios. These homes and studios have been around for some time, but what I learned in my interest and my research in them is that they were like little silos. They didn't have they weren't talking to one another. So that if you were running Olana on the Northeast or running the Elizabeth Ney Museum in Austin, Texas, or the Weir Farm in Connecticut, there was no way in which you could learn best practices for one another, figure out what the interpretive strategies were, and so on and so on. So this is an organization that brings these directors and staffers of these preserved places together. And there are meetings that they have, workshops that they have. They, of course, today they work online together. I encourage you to check it out. I think if you just Google Artists Homes and Studios, it'll pop right up as a website. We started with some 20 sites. There was a call for established studios to join. It was funded by the Luce Foundation. That really made it possible to get going. And NC Wyeth was one of the first to come aboard. That had been one of the first actually to be opened that I knew of in the Northeast. And then Andy came along in around 2013 or so. It joined the association. And the Brandywine is the only museum that I know of that has two such historic properties. making it kind of special, but also special that they took seriously that this was part of their mission, and that they were not just conservatories, they were conserving the land and the art of the region, but they were also going to do the material presence and culture of the Brandywine artists that they had on their property and in their purview. And it's a fascinating organization. I encourage you to learn more about it, because museums are sometimes the owners, national parks are sometimes the owners. It's a wild spectrum. But the Portland Museum, for instance, or another museum has the Homer Studio. Cedar Rapids Museum has the Grant Wood Studio. And when I look back, I have to say my interest, it didn't get started really until the late 90s, maybe late 80s, late 90s. I can't remember when I did my first field trips, starting to look at artists' homes and studios. But when I got started, these were not well studied. And I now realize one of the first things to impress me was visiting the mill and the degree to which the interior of the mill looked a little bit like an Andrew Wyeth painting. And that's, of course, part of the Betsy story. And then when I started to work on Grant Wood, his studio, too, is quite an interesting work of art and important to his story. So I see now that there were little seeds that I can kind of think about, but I hadn't yet sort of focused on them until later in my career.
I can attest how important this organization has been, bringing together best practices, professional network for people thinking specifically about the challenges and opportunities of historic sites of creative practice. So it's a really important part of Wanda's story that she helped this organization to get started. So toward the end of our time now, past really the end of our intended time, but delighted to see 235 people have stuck it out with us, and we will get to more audience questions shortly. Some big picture questions for Wanda I want to be sure to get to. You had your early chapter with Wyeth, and now you've had this other chapter where you've gotten involved with the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, and we see some lovely pictures of you with Andy and Betsy. There's Betsy there. Probably everybody can recognize Andy. Amy Morey, who is now an employee of the Brandywine Museum of Art, working with us up in Maine, and there's Jamie at Wright. So how did you get involved with the foundation? First part. And then the second part of this question is I would love to invite you to start reflecting on the state of Wyeth studies. And I can pose some more questions to draw that out, but I'd love to hear your reflections on where we are at this point from your unique perspective.
Well, when I did the book, and it really, I was the first trained art historian to write a long, sustained essay about Wyeth. I mean that a little immodestly. I'm just amazed when I go back and look and see what I was building on. And the people that were doing the great work on Wyeth were people like Richard Merriman, who was interviewing the artist and getting his words out, and E.P. Richardson, who was talking about technique and helping us see what a dry brush was and the kind of process that Andy was going through, and Betsy. But I really felt that the historian needed to get in there. Anyway, what happened is that I became sort of the in-house historian, if you will, of the Wyeth celebrity, and he was a celebrity, and I found myself, well, I was very flattered, but and I gave lecture after lecture on Wyeth. I was being brought around the country whenever there was a Wyeth show, a small show, or he was in a show. And I still, we didn't mention, but I ended up doing my dissertation on Wyeth. We'll let that one go. But I did that partially because of the pragmatics of it. I was never going to get that other dissertation done the way things were moving in San Francisco. So I enlarged my study, and I think I made it much better, and did a survey of the exhibition, and that became the way I finally got out of school. Now I'm lost my train of.
So this is stepping away from Wyeth before you return to Wyeth.
Yes, I felt I had to step away. Mm-hmm. That's a great way to put it. Isn't that what Meghan and Harry said? They stepped away from royalty. Well, that's exactly what I felt I had to do. And I didn't do it in any kind of dramatic way. I just in my mind thought to myself, I could be a Wyeth scholar for the rest of my life. There's so much work to do that's not being done, but I need to train another generation to come along. And I need to also get this other book, my prior dissertation, which became a book called The Great American Thing. I have to get it done. So I stepped away in the early 80s for about 20 years. We stayed in touch. We sent Christmas cards to one another, but we stopped visiting as much as I had done all during the 70s. I always enjoyed my cocktail hour with the Wyeths long after the exhibition was gone. Then in early 2000s, and I knew about this thing called the Wyeth Foundation, and I knew how important it was as a kind of quiet, grant-giving body that funded exhibitions and various projects in conservation and so on. In any case, around 2000, and you're going to meet Joyce Stoner on one of these conversations later on.
There's Joyce.
There's Joyce right there, perfect. And I hadn't known her, but she was an Institute grad, and she asked me if I wouldn't come see the Wyeths again. She basically brought a message from Mrs. Wyeth, who's also seated there back in the great hat, if I wouldn't come and have another cocktail hour. Well, I was thrilled to do that. I don't know, it was 2000, 2001, something like that. I was absolutely thrilled to sort of go back into the fold. They had a mission. They wanted to invite me to be a part of this wonderful organization, which other art historians and we have our leaders, we have our legal help, we have our businessmen, we have a very nice group of professionals that put their heads together a couple of times a year to run the foundation. And the request came from both. First, Andy asked me, and then Betsy followed up. But I have to say, it felt really good. 25 years later, we were back in touch with one another, and it felt like we were just long lost family members. And it was a love fest there for a little bit. And I have enjoyed my work on this board. It keeps me in touch with what's going on in the field, because we look at proposals and we learn a great deal. And it's also always a pleasure to give support where you think support should go.
It's really important work you do, and the Brandywine is very fortunate to have such a special relationship with this foundation. I see that we just got a question posed in the Q&A from this chap here on the right, so we'll get to those as quick as we can. I'm going to unshare my screen, and I want to ask you just one final question, and we are at time, I'm afraid, but if you have to drop off, thank you for spending time with us. I think that we can probably get in a few questions from the public, and we already have demands for round 2 with Wanda M. Korn, so who knows what the future holds. My final parting question is, how do you see the state of Wyeth studies today, and where do you see it going? Well,
that is a big question. I see it in very good hands, Will. You're going to be the next generation coming along to sort of set the agenda. And I have total confidence that, because I've heard you spell out some of your ideas, and I know they include getting the Betsy-Andy partnership better understood, and not just the partnership, but really Betsy in her own right is a person worth studying, because she had a lot of talents that have never really been talked about. She was, she's really good at landscape and architecture, and she kind of big thinker, mm-hmm. Particularly if we talk about the island as well as the mill. So certainly I know that's one place that you're thinking about and going on. And then there are those people that are interested in ecology. There are those people that are interested in the community, the various communities of Chadds Ford and the fishermen, let's say, of Maine, but the African-American community and the Native American community, and Native American interests of Mrs. Wyeth and Andy and that great portrait of Nogishik. I'm just going to throw this out. You and I haven't had a chance to talk about it, but the world is, we may be slowing down on big blockbuster exhibitions. I think we don't quite know what the post-COVID world is going to be like in museum world, but I am so hungry to look at paintings that really want me to stare at them for a good number of minutes. I find big exhibitions, we float through too much. And I personally am sort of hungry for small focused exhibitions. Like, wouldn't it be great to, if you look at the way the two Obama portraits have just woken up museums across this country, 2 paintings. I don't know what else goes with them. I actually haven't had a chance to see that it's a little show though. But I'm thinking that maybe that might be one way. 5 great portraits by Andrew Wyeth, 5 great landscapes. And then why are they great? What is it that draws us into them and keeps us going? Anyway, that's one thought. If I had enough years in my life, I would also love to do something on the photographer and the Wyeths. I think there have been great photographs of both Wyeths that need attention and need a show. And then, needless to say, if I had enough years in my life, I would do something on Betsy Wyeth's sense of fashion. And I always think that she sort of dressed Andy. So it's really her sense of fashion, but he was a great model for all her great ideas of Amish jackets and turtlenecks and big woolly sweaters and so on. So those are some very quick thoughts.
Some exciting ideas in there. I like that. So let's get to some questions from the crowd. Here's one from our friend Bill Martin, an important part of the Wyeth Foundation. He asks, how do the Wyeth properties in Maine and also the Olson House maintained by the Farnsworth Museum fit into the understanding of the work of Andy and the collaborative creative legacy of Andrew and Betsy Wyeth?
Yes, well, the Olson House, of course, is owned and run by the Farnsworth Museum, and we need to say the Farnsworth Museum is sort of Wyeth North, isn't that what you call it, or something? Wyeth.
Sure. Yeah. We now have the Wyeth Study Center, South and North. Yeah.
South and North.
Yes,
okay. Yeah. Because there's also an amazing collection of Maine material that's stored and shown at the Farnsworth Museum in Maine, and they run the Olson House. The Olson House is, in a weird way, it is an artist studio, because we know that Andy actually lived there, so to speak, not staying the night necessarily, but he had a room or 2 upstairs that were his to use as a studio for many years. So that's a curious setup. And it's one of our great sort of iconic, if you will, pieces of art history that has been saved. And there's a story about how Joseph Levine bought it at one point and Betsy helped restore it. And it has a wonderful, wonderful history. It's another piece of material culture, if you will, and people, I think, thrilled to walk through it because they can see the grounds. There's a little graveyard at the Olson House. So that is, if you will, the preserved home to the Farnsworth, as the preserved studios in Brandywine are to the Brandywine Museum.
That's helpful perspective. Tom Payton, director of the Brandywine Museum of Art, asks, while working on the San Francisco exhibition, did Andy ever let you into his studio to look at paintings underway?
No.
No. Okay.
Tom, and I don't think, Joyce, you have to ask this question of Joyce next, but as I've understood it, no one got to see paintings underway, not even Mrs. Wyeth. She would get to see them when they would come home, and he might take them back and make changes. But that was, I never stepped into a studio space. And I actually, I don't know that I tried too hard, but it was on my mind to want to do that. But it was quite clear to me that when he went off to the studio, he went alone.
Understood. We have a couple of questions here who are intrigued by that kind of incendiary title of your Rethinking Andrew Wyeth essay, Lifting the Curse. Could you help them understand what you mean by a curse in relation to Andrew Wyeth?
Yes. I certainly can. But I hope it's a subject that can just go away. And we can get on to a new generation's way of thinking about Wyeth. But Wyeth came up against a very heavy set of art critics in the 50s and 60s when he's getting going. He gets going in the 30s. For God's sake, he's only 20 years old when he has his first exhibition. And his first shows are in watercolors, and they're very positively reviewed. But eventually the curse sets in. And what I mean by the curse are those critics who found that what he was doing was, and they came up with a set of labels for it, which I don't agree with, but it was the times to make judgments and to call the shots. That's what art critic was intended to do. Criticism has changed very much today. It's not the same thing, but in those days, critics were meant to be guides to our taste, our good taste, guides to our collecting, guides to who we should go see and how we should think about them and so on. And criticism at that time, for a whole variety of reasons, we don't possibly have enough time to say why this was, decided that Andy was living in a different century than the 20th century, that he was an old-fashioned artist, his realism, his subject matter, I mean, the thing that I now remark upon, looking back on it, is why he didn't suffer more from this, but he didn't really. It would make him edgy, I think, but he never stopped making pictures because of it. And I mean, Grant Wood was another one that suffered a lot of critical disdain. And he crumbled under it, totally crumbled, and became a lesser artist because of it. But Andy did not. And Andy always had his strong supporters, like Lincoln Kirsten, for instance, someone like that. Or later on, Thomas Hoving became a great Wyeth fan. So he always had people who he could, I suppose, count on if he did get into a punk mood about it. But I don't think he did. He used to say, I only know one thing to do. I only know how to make art. And truer words were never spoken. He also knew how to make people laugh and have fun, but he didn't see that as the skill that mattered. He was the most dedicated, and this is one thing that drove me to actually try to understand him better. I never known anybody so dedicated to his craft, so determined. Every day he had to get out there or he was going to be moody.
It's really valuable, powerful perspective. I love hearing these stories. One question I see a couple of people raise, because we have a lot of NC Wyeth fans in the Brandywine orbit, is to what extent was NC Wyeth a part of your interest in Andy in the early days, a part of your research leading to the dissertation and the exhibition? You did mention at one point the value of the Betsy Letters project. So
Yes.
Any comment on NC
Yes.
as a gateway?
Well, I'll just say that when I took on Andy, the NC part of his story was thought to be harmful to him, in that NC Wyeth was the illustrator. Even we know that now, when we now know very clearly, NC Wyeth was also an aspiring artist and really had a kind of tortured life because people wanted him to be the great illustrator and were less interested in his easel paintings. But so when I took on my project, NC was really the bad member of the family to talk about, because it sort of it put Andy into the orbit of the history of illustration. But when I read those letters, I learned about what it was like to grow up with this man. And he was such a super dad. Dad is not quite the right word. I mean, he's super drama person. He was such a big personality. And I mean, he was scary the way he would introduce his children to holidays and have them dress up and keep them entertained and quote Thoreau one day and listen to Sibelius the next. He was just constantly making a life for those children, and I just couldn't get over it. So I did introduce NC Wyeth in a big way to my story. It was like part 2 is what it was like to grow up and learn the art of what I called empathizing with nature, with trees, with rocks, with what people were wearing, because he was such a great person of understanding how costume could tell something about person. Anyway, I made it a big deal, and I showed my manuscript to Richard Merriman. I needed help, and the only person I knew to sort of give it to was Richard, and he was great. He read it through, but he said, "Get rid of N.C. Wyeth." He said, "There's too much dad in this picture." And then I did, I guess, take out some. I don't know, but I remember Betsy saying to me, "Richard still thinks there's too much N.C. Wyeth in your essay. Get rid of it in the dissertation," or something like that.
Gotcha. All right. I really think we have to cut this off, but I'll do just one more fun question to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Wanda, and thank you all for spending this evening with us. We have a nice light one to end on from my friend Amy Torbert of the St. Louis Art Museum, who, noting as I did the centrality of cocktail hour to Wyeth World, asks what the Wyeth's drinks of choice were.
Oh, ask Joyce Stoner that.
Joyce will tell us. Okay.
She's better. But my husband and I actually talked about that. And mixed drinks were part of it, but so was just scotch on the rocks, I think. But it was always, we're not talking beer and wine. We're talking, liquor of some sort. But I can't remember, but Joyce is probably just squirming like crazy wherever she is watching this, because she'll be able to cite chapter and verse as to the way even their tastes changed over the years. So good question, Amy.
All right, we'll make sure to ask her that when she does the next of these Wyeth Conversations, March 7th, I think it is. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Stay tuned for more programs of the Wyeth Study Center and the Brandywine Museum of Art. Thank you so much to our speaker, Professor Wanda M.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.